Okay, so welcome everybody. I think it's the seventh seminar of the Mathematical Laws and Morphology, Mathematical Laws of Biomechanics and Morphology seminar series. It's a great pleasure for us to have Professor Kiefer here, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Exercise Sport Science at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's also leading the STAR Lab at UNC Chapel Hill. Professor Kiefer has a PhD in experimental psychology from University of Cincinnati. He has postdoctoral experience at Brown University, and he had also previously a master from Bergen University and a Bachelor of Science from Wisconsin Cross. He has also served as assistant professors at U Cincinnati, and now he's continuing his work on resilience, sport performance, nonlinear dynamics, and many activities. So he has also an inventor of two sport technology patents. He's co-founder and CEO of Ellipse LLC, which is a sport technology company. He has many interesting research, and today we are here about some of that directly through his voice. So thanks a lot for the opportunity to have you here in the seminar series.
Thank you, Alessandro. I appreciate it. I'll go ahead and share my screen here, hopefully. There we go. All right, I'll share that, and then, all right, you have full slide view now? Good, awesome. Well, thank you, Alessandro, for having me here. I'm really excited to get a chance to speak with all of you, and I'm excited to get some feedback from this group as well. So, as you saw with the title of my talk, it is on state and parameter dynamics and human performance, and really focusing on behavioral resilience. And I use resilience broadly to mean, sort of anything, whether it is performance-based or whether it's injury prevention-based, or whether it's returning from injury and returning successfully and safely. So it is broad. I'm going to focus mostly sort of on the performance side today, although some of the data I'm going to present towards the end does have to do with some neural health changes and how they elicit response changes in behavior. First, and I appreciate the wonderful introduction. There we go. Just to give you a little bit more background about my research team and my lab. So I am a co-director of STAR Heal Performance Laboratory, which stands for Simulation, Training, Analytics, and Rehabilitation. And I co-direct that with a colleague of mine, Dr. Jana Register-Mihalik. We also have a full-time technical lead. You'll see that a lot of our work is pretty technical. I'm not going to focus on as much of the technical aspects of it today, but we do a lot of tech transfer. We generate IP out of the lab as well. We're also sort of at the intersection of a couple of groups here on campus. I'm core faculty within the Matthew Gefeller Center, which is focused really on neural health broadly and concussion specifically. And then we have within our Department of Exercise and Sports Science, the Motion Science Institute, which is what it sounds like, a lot of motion capture related research going on around biomechanics of performance and health. And then the Sports Medicine Institute, which is a partnership between the Department of Orthopedics and the School of Medicine here and our Department of Exercise and Sports Science, where we try to take basic theory research and match it with evidence-based practice to examine orthopedic health conditions. And primarily the work I do there is in ACL or knee injury. And so STAR Heal is an R&D environment. We're cloud native. We work closely with AWS, and that allows us to scale a lot of our work quickly and out to stakeholders. And our mission is to conduct research and innovate real-world applications that sort of sit at the intersection between behavioral and movement science. We utilize immersive technologies and artificial intelligence, machine learning, complex systems modeling to improve health and performance outcomes. And so foundational to this mission is my own theoretical commitment to complex systems and how we leverage nonlinear dynamics and modeling techniques to understand how human behavior adapts within different behavioral or environmental contexts. So I want to begin by just kind of defining the way I think about behavioral resilience, and that's I try to be, again, pretty broad. And it's just the ability of the system, in this case, the human system, to adapt and maintain a desired function, even in the face of variations in conditions. And those variations can come from the environment, from task demands, or even personal factors, whether it's related to injury, insult, fatigue, those sorts of things. And so as we consider athletic performance, we see sort of this higher level stability in behavioral outcomes, which you can see across these different videos, even as perturbations and changes occur to these athletes. And in order for these athletes to sort of adapt and maintain that function, even in the case of even the middle video where the woman is getting knocked down and jumping back up, it requires the availability of multiple behavioral solutions from which the athlete can sort of connect to and pull off. And so we need stability of task outcomes, right? We need to score the goal, shoot the basketball through the basket, et cetera. But we need flexibility of behavioral patterns in order to preserve those task outcomes. And so we need a generalizable framework that can, sorry, I'll pop up here. There we go. That can index and model these features of resilient behavior, and that, more importantly, allows for a lawful description of what I call the athlete environment system. And I'm going to lean on a quote that I love. It's one of my favorite quotes, and I like to use it in a lot of my talks, is that in order to understand or to explain or predict, we need to know the laws, and it's our own fault if we don't know the laws. That was by James Gibson, sort of the father of ecological psychology. And that's what the behavioral dynamics framework allows us to start to unpack. So what it really does is it operationalizes the athlete environment system as a pair of connected dynamical systems. And these are coupled mechanically and informationally, so that the E vector for environment is just a vector of environmental state variables. And the A vector is a vector of athlete state variables. And the overdot on both of those is indicating change in those state variables over time. And the changes in the environment, E, are a function of the current state of the environment and the current value of F, which we see over here under action. And F is really the external forces that are produced by the athlete on the environment. And changes in the athlete state variables are a function of the current state of the athlete. You can think about that as their current neuromotor or biomechanical state, and current values of I, or information, that are coming to the athlete. And so this is sort of governed by two types of laws. Laws of control, which sort of are more related to that action, that F sort of equation down there, and laws of ecological optics. Now, the ecological optics side is really based on visual information. The framework itself is not beholden to just visual information, but that's where we tend to study it. It's a little bit easier to uncover. And so the laws are the actions of the athlete that affect their relation to the environment and make new information available. And then that information regulates action, and the informational variables continue to guide behavior. And we can use this guided by some tenets that we can explore changes in the athlete environment system over time. And that's where we see the emergence of the behavioral dynamics up there in the upper right of the athlete environment schematic. We have behaviors that we can then describe as in terms of the solutions of the system's dynamics. And this is in terms of attractors, repellers, bifurcations, phase transitions, etc. And then we can also characterize these across different scales as changes to state, parameter, and graph dynamics, which is sort of born out of a lot of the work that Elliot Saltzman was doing in the late 80s and the early 90s. And so we can use this as a computational roadmap for investigating athletic resilience by building up our knowledge of objective state variables and then figuring out how those variables influence or are influenced by the feedback loops that we see in the behavioral dynamics. And most importantly, what this means is that interaction dominant dynamics rule. So it's not enough for me to take a reductionist approach down and look at a specific component, like a specific state variable of an athlete, and look at that in isolation, but rather it matters how these different variables are interacting with one another to produce emergent changes in behavior. And so here is an example of behavioral dynamics in action. This is work that was done by Fajan and Warren back in the early 2000s, where they built up a model of steering behavior for human navigation. And so over here on the left, top left, you can see that we have an individual. There's a goal that they're trying to sort of move their heading so that their direction of travel is toward the goal. And it's governed by a variety of factors, thinking back to that behavioral dynamics schematic. And they've developed a model of steering dynamics that's based on the angular acceleration of heading. So we have the reference frame right here, and that's sort of an arbitrary reference frame. And you can see we're able to compute the heading direction, or phi, off of that. And then we also have the angular position of the goal, which is psi g. And then we can take the difference of that, and that we can compute as heading error. And so this model is designed really around angular acceleration of how does that heading sort of correct that error and snap toward the goal. We can do the same thing for obstacles. And I should mention that this is based on a mass spring model, so that you also have K terms and B terms, K being the stiffness of the spring to either pull that angular acceleration toward the trajectory that you want to transition to, and be damping that effect. Or if you're dealing with obstacles, it has the reverse effect. It's sort of pushing or repelling that angular acceleration away from the obstacle. And so we can look at this in terms of an example that Fajan and Warren use. So here you have an individual walking to that green goal. There's a black circular obstacle in their path. And we can use sample vector fields to represent this. And so here, the sample vector field exhibits sort of the darkened dots with a negative slope exhibit that attractor, or a point attractor. And that's pulling the angular acceleration into a stable state. And then open circles, as you'll see in a minute, indicate repellers along with that positive slope crossing the x-axis. So here we have an individual. They're on a stable trajectory where they're moving towards the goal. The obstacle has not started to influence them yet. As they reach that obstacle, though, they reach sort of a bifurcation point where we have a singular repeller, and we have two potential stable solutions. And those just represent being able to go to the left or the right of that obstacle. And then as the athlete or individual moves to one of those stable solutions, we see the other stable solution sort of dissipating over time. So now it's not actually a manifested attractor state. It's sort of what we consider like a ghost attractor, where it was there and it's sort of fading out. And then as the athlete moves further past the obstacle, we see that we're back to a singular solution. Now, all of this is sort of happening at that sort of broad overt behavioral level, but we have a lot going on underneath the surface too, right? So we have that apparent stable performance as represented by these attractor spaces, but then the neuromotor system, for example, has a state dynamics that are going to sort of integrate and segregate based on how the coordination of the motor coordination needs to assemble itself to achieve whatever this sort of behavioral goal is. And these state dynamics, we know, sort of indicate intermittency, which is just periods of sort of smooth regularity or smooth predicted behavior that are interrupted by bursts or dips in sort of the state time series of the system. So this is sort of the theoretical framework that I'm working from. I'm going to do a quick deviation into sort of the tech that we use to assess athletes in these different environmental scenarios, and then we'll get into some data. So I've spent about the last 12 or 13 years developing mixed reality, extended reality environments for sport assessment. I just want to give a little bit of a timeline. So when I was at Brown in my postdoc, we were looking at a lot of sort of basic locomotor navigation tasks. You can see some of our rudimentary environments. We have a really expensive Rockwell Collins $50,000 head-mounted display that my postdoc colleague there is wearing. And we were just looking at how do individuals navigate around, stationary or moving obstacles while walking toward a goal. When I started in my first faculty position at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, Oculus had started to come on the scene. We were able to start to customize our own head-mounted display to look at simulating sport-specific environments a little bit better. And here you can see we actually invented that wireless sport head-mounted display, and we were assessing landing biomechanics of athletes as they performed a soccer header task. We then scaled up as the Microsoft HoloLens 1 came out, and we started playing around with augmented reality environments. So here was a project we worked on in partnership. See if I can play that again for you, where we built the environment there. You can see our sort of virtual human setting a virtual volleyball. And we sent this down to some colleagues in Australia who were doing some work with Australian Olympic volleyball athletes. And they were seeing the same stimulus, but they have a hanging volleyball that's kind of tough to see in the still shot. And what they were basically doing was running up and spiking that volleyball in time with that virtual set ball. And we were able to look at the landing biomechanics in those environments. And then we started playing around with some navigation type tasks in the HoloLens. HoloLens was limited though in that its visual field was only about, I think 38 degrees was the first one. So we pivoted back to VR for a little bit while we waited for AR to catch up. And I started exploring more complex navigational tasks. Here we have an individual running to that stationary goal, avoiding some virtual humanoid figures. We have eye tracking embedded in our headset at this point, and are exploring sort of how navigational paths emerge as they relate to collision risk. And then when I started here down at Carolina, I was able to receive an NIH grant to start building out a digital platform. And this is sort of the stage that we're in now, where you can see our characters are a bit more sort of gender neutral. They're sort of robotic looking, and we can start to play around with the environmental state variables that we're interested in to see how those influence action and information coming back to the individual. And then the Meta headsets have been instrumental in allowing us to get out of the lab a little bit. And so that led to the development of the ADAPT platform, and that just stands for Automated Digital Assessment and Precision Training Platform. And this is a VR environment now. We hope that it'll scale to augmented reality eventually once the hardware catches up. But it allows us to move up into the gymnasiums that are here in our department. And so you can see on the left over here, we are actually having athletes run from one corner of the half court across to the other. You'll see in a minute, we have a virtual called non-player character target running, and the participant's job, the human's job, is to intercept that moving target as if they're trying to intercept through, tackle somebody in football or try to steal the ball in soccer. And then we have, one or more virtual defenders that are sort of impeding their progress in some way. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play this video on the right. This is the VR first-person view. And the athlete will be running away from us towards the purple target that you'll see in a minute. Unfortunately, the way we captured it is the same athlete is running toward us here in this foreground. But what I want you to pay attention to are two things. One is how the athlete is, navigating their way through these defenders, but also how it's creating sort of naturalistic movement patterns by the athlete that resemble what we would see on an athletic field or court. So I'll go ahead and play that. Every time they collide, in this case she's colliding a lot, one of the defenders will turn red. We do not use auditory stimuli though, because we don't want them to stop moving. We want them to keep moving through. I'll play that one more time. Oops, in case you want to pay attention to the other pane. And so we're getting decelerations, accelerations, cutting, sprinting, those sorts of things throughout the environment. And then now we have sort of an experimentally controlled environment where we can get a lot of data. So we can get positional tracking data, which is just like GPS data from the headset. We've looked at electromyography, EMG data to look at neurophysiological muscle activations. We have autonomic nervous system function through heart rate and heart rate variability. We've played around with markerless motion capture to get kinematic analyses. And we have self-report analyses to rate of perceived exertion, perceived difficulty, perceived success, those sorts of things. But we also have introduced sort of these models and AI into our defenders. And so we utilize those steering dynamics models to inform the defenders on how they need to navigate to impede the progress of the human. And what that means is that their behaviors are sort of grounded in a validated model of human behavior. We also have an action capabilities model, which takes into account the size and sort of strength, in this case simulated strength, of the non-player character to represent deceleration patterns into what we call soft collision, to where they're not colliding with the human. They're not trying to. The human may collide with them, but they are trying to sort of match up with the human and impede their progress. We can also create higher level tactics. This is an example of creating zones where we can tell the defenders not to interact with the human until they cross a sort of imaginary threshold. The blocks are snapping into place here, but that's just because it's following a heuristic. We don't have those other models built into the blocks. They are built into our humanoid NPCs. And then we can also use those same string dynamics models to build a probabilistic mapping of where the human is likely to navigate in a given scene. And we can feed that data into our non-player characters as well. What I'm most excited about, though, is our kinematic simulation engine. So how these NPCs are starting to move. And it wasn't apparent in those videos that I showed earlier of the athlete moving through the scene. And that's because those are a little bit outdated from some of our more recent advancements. But basically, I want to turn your attention to sort of two animations here. So I'm going to play these. And you'll probably notice pretty quickly that one animation, the top one, looks a little bit more rigid, a little bit less smooth in terms of behavioral transitions to different shifts of body weight and things, where the bottom one just looks a little bit smoother, a little bit more natural. I mean, they're both artificial. What's interesting is both of these animated characters are driven by human biomechanics data, kinematic data. The top one is a state machine engine, and that's what's traditionally been used. So that's where we collect the kinematic data. We try to stitch together sort of these discretized clips of movement, and then we try to blend them by interpolating transitions. But in reality, they're really playing out a certain number of frames before we can get the virtual human to shift into a new behavioral trajectory. Our engine is using a combination of the steering dynamics model there and a motion matching framework, where we go in and we say, okay, what is the NPC's current pose? What is their most likely next 5 time steps in terms of their current speed and their current heading trajectory? And now let's go and find other frames of poses that are most likely to be played back based on the constraints of that forward moving vector. And what that allows us to do is every kinematic signature of movement for each frame is grounded in actual human data, but is emergent in responding to how the human is interacting with these virtual characters. This is all important for when we think about transferring what the athlete might train to, what information they might pay attention to, as we then release them back out into real world performance. So before I get into a bunch of our experiments, I just want to show sort of a precursor of some of our data that was important. And that is, can we even elicit behavioral changes when we give human athletes a different number of defenders? And what I mean by that are, can we look at things like, do we increase the length of the navigation path that they need to take to intercept the moving target? Can we look at how long it takes them in terms of time, how many collisions they experience? What are the sort of maximum acceleration or the variability in acceleration and deceleration? Are we inducing behavioral changes? And what our initial results have shown is that, yes, indeed, what you would expect. As things get more challenging with more defenders, we tend to start to see changes. And in some cases, it only needs to be that we go from no defenders to 2, and all of a sudden we've induced some of those changes, and everything after that is sort of the same. But in others, like collisions, which we see over here, we see a steady rise in collisions as we go up to 5 defenders. So what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about are a few different experiments that we've run using this adapt system to try to tease apart both the state dynamics and the parameter dynamics relative to the framework that I laid out at the beginning. So I'm going to start by talking about a functional reaction time task and how neuromuscular state dynamics are sort of emerging as athletes are poised to respond to that moving target. Then we're going to look at some visual scanning dynamics. How are they moving their head in the visual scene to try to pick up visual information as they navigate the complex scene? And then I'm going to present some modeling that we've done on both how the athletes try to intercept those targets and also how they control their deceleration as they come into interception of those targets. And then finally, talk a little bit about how some neural health related changes, predominantly concussion history, can maybe influence how risky the athlete's behavior is as they're trying to perform these different tasks.
So I have a question. It might be a good time to ask.
Sure.
It's related to the athlete environment framework. So in that framework, so if you have a different number of athletes, is it one single athlete which is coded as A and everything else in the environment, or A is something like a vector, like there can be many athletes there, and separately there is a conditional environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way we approach it is there's only one A, and the A has their own sort of state variables that emerge. But technically, you're right. Every one, even the non-player characters, are technically A's in this, right? And so if we were going to scale this up into sort of like a multi-agent sort of situation, then each athlete, whether it's a human or virtual athlete, would have their own sort of athlete environment, paired coupled dynamical systems going, and then those would all also be interacting at multiple scales. And Bill Warren's done some of that work in pedestrian dynamics, but we're starting a little bit simpler right now. But you're exactly right in how you're thinking about how we would sort of scaffold this up from a single athlete.
Yeah, and I guess the contact sports could be one of the first ones, right? Because it's just one versus one, and so maybe that's one of the first steps.
Exactly. And you'll see we start to do a little bit of that because we do in one of these experiments reduce the sort of the epoch of interest down to an athlete, the human, and a single defender interaction, and start to look at, and that's how we look at sort of the scanning dynamics. But we also are running some experiments where we've reduced it down to a single athlete as well. Okay, so let's jump into the functional reaction time dynamics. So here we had 17 collegiate club contact sport athletes, and we're collecting EMG, so that's neuromuscular activation using wireless EMG sensors at 4 sites. And we looked at this during a no defender condition versus a 3 defender conditions. We also consider that sort of load. So you have your athlete. They're in the VR environment, right? They're seeing that purple target. And for the high load condition, they're navigating among those 3. And then we've got EMG sensors on the right and left quadriceps and the right or left gastrocnemius or calf muscles. And what I was really interested in is what do the sort of neuromuscular dynamics look like as the athlete is preparing to take off to pursue that target? And do environmental state changes such as just knowing that I've now have more complex information and seen with the defenders, or knowing that the load is going to be increased for this trial, does that change the way that my state dynamics sort of are emerging in preparation for what I'm going to have to do? And this is where I use a method called recurrence quantification analysis. And I like this because it allows for us to sort of understand how behavior is sort of repeating in time, and how the system is sort of visiting or moving away from different states. It also has very few assumptions, so it works really well if time series are short, if time series are non-stationary, if there's a lot of noise. Even if they're interval versus continuous data, we can still work with them in recurrence analysis. And basically what we're doing is we're just counting how often the system recurs with itself, in this case a time series, and then we quantify those patterns of recurrence. So here I just have sort of an example sine wave, right? And so you have, for this particular data point that starts right here, it's going to recur with itself periodically based on the parameters that set off the sine wave. But also you would look at the same thing. You'd have a recurrence here relative to this point, and here relative to this point and this point. And we do specify the boundary of that recurrence, so it doesn't have to be exactly recurrent, right? We create a sensitivity parameter that allows us to look at this. But it provides a really rich sort of multi-temporal and spatial description of the state dynamics, and it gives us a suite of output measures. So the way it works is that we take the time series. In this case, we would take a single EMG time series from like the right quad, and we would use a delay and an embedding parameter to embed it in reconstructed phase space. And that's just an example there on the left here. And so for each point within that space, we create that sensitivity parameter or that neighborhood, and we say, okay, how many other data points fall within this neighborhood in phase space? And then we plot those recurrences over here on what we call a recurrence plot. So because we're looking at data, a single time series in this case, here we have this particular data point recurring with itself. So we end up getting this line of identity, which would be similar to the main diagonal of a correlation matrix. And so we don't really pay attention to anything on that main diagonal, and this is going to end up being a symmetrical plot. So we only look at 1/2 of the recurrence plot when we're dealing with a single time series. So then what we do is we say, okay, so for data point 50, how many other data points recur with it based on our sensitivity parameter, and we add those to our recurrence plot, as you can see there on the right. And then we move on to the next point. And I'm just showing this for a few points, but we would do this for every point in the time series and compare it. And we build structure and structure and structure, and eventually we get a recurrence plot. And then we can compute different variables off of this. The 6 primary ones that I typically deal with are shown here. The ones on the left, percent REC, which is percent recurrence, percent DET, which is percent determinism, and max line look at the diagonal, well, they look at the diagonal line structures. Percent recurrence is what is the percentage of red points in this plot versus the percentage versus all of the potential points that could have been red. So if you think about the recurrence plot as a 1-0 matrix, how many ones are in it out of all the possible ones that could have been in it. Percent determinism is going to say how many of those recurrent points fall on a diagonal line of 2 or more data points. Max line is going to say what is your longest diagonal line. Determinism and max line are sort of a measure of predictability of the system, or the temporal evolution, the regular temporal evolution over time. So they're repeating, there's repeated recurrences in consecutive frames or time steps. And then percent laminarity, trapping time, and Vmax line are just vertical line measures. And so percent laminarity is the equivalent of percent determinism, only in vertical lines. So what percentage of recurrent points fall on a vertical line. Trapping time is the average length of a vertical line, and Vmax line is just the maximum length of a vertical line. And those vertical line measures typically are associated with things like intermittency or things like stickiness when a system gets trapped or stuck in a state before it comes out into a new sort of stable solution. So in this case, I was interested in looking at those vertical line measures, and we looked at the EMG dynamics from the time the target appeared until 230 milliseconds after. And this was related to we didn't want to have too much noise in the data of them actually moving and getting up to sort of a normal gait cycle. And then we looked at what their functional reaction time was, which was when they had moved 0.5 meters in sort of a vertical or forward motion space using the HMD position variables. And this is preliminary. We're looking at a more complex analysis than this, but this is basically what it looks like. So we might have the entire time series here, and then what we're actually looking at is just these initial 230 milliseconds, and then we would reconstruct it in phase space. This is not the actual phase space. I plotted this in 3 dimensions just so we can visualize it. The actual phase space ends up being 7 embedding dimensions, and you get a recurrence plot that looks something like this. And it's really easy to line these up. You can see how we get more white space, and then as it stabilizes, you're getting blockiness and sort of stuckness within a given state. So what we found is that for the quad and the gastroc, when there were no defenders, we had sort of a higher trapping time. So they were a little bit more stable and stuck. And as we added load, you actually saw that decrease, and we had less vertical line structures that were shorter. Likewise, with vertical line max, we saw the same thing with the quadriceps. We did not see significant differences, but we started to see the same trend there. We've run more subjects since then, and we're now processing the data, and we're going to start looking across more sites and looking at sort of lead versus follow legs as they're getting ready to move and those sorts of things. But it's starting to show that the environmental change does impact how the state dynamics of the neuromuscular system sort of are emerging and sort of poised to respond. So now with scanning dynamics, what we are interested here is how do athletes scan the visual field? In this case, we have a VR headset with a fixed central visual field, but we know that as they move it, it's going to allow them to access more information. And we had the target speed moving again at 70% of their speed, and they performed trials with 2, 3, 4, or 5 defenders. And then what we did is, as I was mentioning earlier, we looked at human-defender interaction. So anytime the human came within a 1.5 meter radius of a defender, we counted that as an interaction, and we analyzed the scanning data leading into that interaction. And we also computed whether they collided with or did not collide with the non-player character. And so you can see there we had 108 collisions and about 1,200 non-collision interactions across our 39 athletes, 40 trials per athlete. And then we ran a fluctuation intensity analysis, which I'll talk about in a second, on the XYZ position data, or based on the HMD position data here. And then we ran a confirmatory factor analysis to look at whether we could take the results of that fluctuation intensity analysis and put them into one or more factors of quote unquote scanning behavior. And I'll show what those results were here. So our fluctuation analysis, we borrowed from Shipek and Strunk, and it's called fluctuation intensity analysis. And basically what we do is we apply this to a time series of head angular positions for each of those interactions. And we segment the time series at boundaries, which are defined as K. They're defined by sign changes that index head movement direction changes. And we run this separately for each X position, Y position, and Z position. And then the absolute difference between that head angular position at those consecutive K boundaries is divided by the number of data points between the boundaries. And this gives us essentially a rate of change metric, which reflects head movement speed in a direction before direction changes. So that's like scanning behavior. And then we also get a fluctuation index, which sums each segment's rate of change. So how quickly did they scan and the magnitude of that change, where higher values are going to indicate quicker and more frequent changes in head direction. And this correlates really well with standard measures like sample entropy, if you're familiar with that, which is useful for analyzing short non-stationary time series, which some of these were somewhat short because we're sampling at 60 hertz and we could be at 200 or 300 milliseconds of interaction time. And so we then took those fluctuation intensity metrics for X, Y, and Z, and we submitted them to a confirmatory factor analysis, and we found that there are really two factors. One was the amount that the athletes were scanning, which you can see there as F1, and the other was the way in which, the structure with which they were changing positions in scanning. So think about that as sort of how predictable the scanning. So we have amount and then sort of how predictable or unpredictable were the head movements. And we ran these through a linear mixed effects model to examine the relationship between F1 and F2 on collisions. And what we found is that with the amount of head rotations, so the amount of scanning, that there was a main effect where the more head rotations you had, the fewer collisions you had, or the greater avoidance. And then we also saw an interaction effect with our conditions in that the main effect was driven by the 2 defender condition. And once we added more than 2 defenders, we think, we don't have the data to back this up yet, that it creates almost like a tunneling of vision where scanning really starts to break down completely. And it's just a different task context altogether. And then we also saw that the structure of the head movements matters. So here we had a main effect for F2, and we showed that the more consistent, predictable your head movements are, the better your collision avoidance was. So sort of like if we can predict a bit better how you're scanning, then it's more likely that you're using a strong scanning strategy. What's cool about this data is these are modifiable behaviors. We can work with athletes to improve scanning strategies, and particularly in VR where they don't get hurt if they collide. And so that's something that we're going to start to pursue as sort of a way to potentially help improve return to play safety following concussion and even primary concussion prevention. So now I'm going to get into the modeling side. Both of those previous experiments were really focused on the state dynamics. Now we're going to look at how the parameters change. So here we were looking at 47 collegiate contact sport athletes, and we changed the target speed this time from 50 to 100% of athlete speed, so that we end up with almost 1,300 trials of data. And we were trying to fit the Fajan and Warren model shown there to the data. And what we have with this model is we really have typically two parameters that they don't usually fit to the data, which are your K and your B, your stiffness and your damping terms. You can see the traditional parameters there. And then C1 and C2 are sort of the strength and slope of the attractor function. And so the parameters you see in that blue box are how they fit their model to human walking data. But we've never fit this data to a running context or different populations, including athletes. And so we said, let's just take a first pass and use the existing parameters and see if the model fits. And it does not. So here you see the blue line is the goal position. You have the red line, which is the predicted position, and the green line is the athlete's actual position. And you can see our RMSE values are really high. There's not a good fit. And you can honestly probably look at this and see that there's definitely a strategy that the human athletes are taking that the model is not accounting for. And so this is also preliminary. In fact, we have simulations going as I'm presenting to you right now, where we're starting to do a new parameter fit. And what we're converging on is that as B decreases and K increases, which are the parameters we're focusing on right now, we're seeing a much improved fit. And you can see here, we have K up here going from 5 to 9, B down here going from 5 to 8, and then we have the RMSE values here. And you can already see these are much smaller RMSE values. And so we're converging down here, but there also seems to be some sort of transition in terms of how the parameters are fitting based on certain values. So there's a lot we still need to do here. One of the things we're obviously not accounting for is speed in this model. This is strictly an angular acceleration of heading. And so there's some speed components that we'll also need to bring in. But we're taking a first stab at just seeing how well we can fit to the data using the traditional model.
Just to make sure I'm not misunderstanding what those parameters are, what is psi g? I think you mentioned it early on, but
yeah, sure. Psi g is going to be based on that arbitrary reference axis that you see, that dotted line. Okay. It is the angular position of the goal to that reference axis. And we just use the reference axis so that everything is sort of relative to it, even the participant's heading.
Good. And in the term that multiplies like the exponential term plus C2, is there any dependence on the angle there?
On that E term there?
Yes. Is there any dependence on phi there?
There is not. Where you what is dependent on is distance.
Okay, good.
So that's the little d there, is the distance to the goal.
Okay, good. So there is no phi involved there. So it's a linear system in practice.
Yes. Yeah, and that has to do with the attractor's influence on the agent or the human.
Okay, good, great. Thank you.
So, if we were to talk in a month, I probably would have more interesting results than what we have right now, but we are starting to make some progress in this regard. Where I think our more exciting modeling results are some of the work one of my doc students has been working on with respect to, can we model the deceleration profiles as the athlete is getting ready to intercept that target at the tail end of the trial. And this is work based on David Lee's work in the 70s on time to contact, or tau. I'm not sure if folks are familiar, so I'll just give sort of a brief overview. The idea here is that instead of having to do sort of computational modeling in our heads, we basically are just looking at relevant visual information and looking at change in that information to determine whether our current behavior is adequate for completing the task, in this case of not colliding with an object, or if we have to modulate heading, or in this case speed. And so let's say that we're running towards this brick wall and we have the focus of expansion of that wall in our sort of optical visual field. And at time 1, that focus of expansion, we perceive it to be as such with this size, and we can look at the area there for computing it out. And then we can update that at our next time that we decide to sort of pay attention. And obviously I'm discretizing a continuous behavior. And then we can compare the difference there. And based on the difference, we know that, okay, it's getting bigger, so I'm getting closer. and the sort of coupling between my metabolic output and that change gives me an understanding of sort of the control law that's guiding when do I need to start braking and when have I waited too long and I'm going to collide with this object. And so you're basically looking at the change in area from time 1 to time 2 as a way to sort of compute this. And then Lee talked about it using this equation. So you have the change in the area over the change in time divided by area, and that gives you the tau variable. And David Lee proposed that we are essentially interacting with an array of field times specified by this tau control law in everything that we do as we move through our world. And that tau can help us sort of calibrate to objects in scene. One of the best examples that I've found to show this are gannets, who have to time the action of the folding of their wings as they enter the water as they're hunting fish. And you can see there, it's a great shot of how they're timing that all out. And this is sort of the argument of they're not actually computing the math in their head, but they're using this tau variable, this change, rate of change relative to sort of position to dictate the timing of actions. And they're doing this diving from heights of 45 meters at speeds of 100 kilometers per hour. And if they weren't able to time this appropriately, they'd be breaking their wings and effectively killing themselves. So we're using this idea, but in our case, the consequences aren't quite as dire. And we're just looking at, can athletes intercept this target in an ideal way? And so Dominic, my student, looked at 21 club sport athletes again with those same speed changes from 50 to 100% of athlete speed. And he pulled a D-ideal model that Brett Fajan proposed back in 2007. And Brett's model is based on a couple of factors. One is sort of a global optic flow rate. So that's the idea of what is the flow rate of information as you're moving through the world. And that's computed based on your velocity v over eye height. And then the tau variable, which I've simplified just to be the rate of change of the visual angle over the visual angle in this case. And so what Brett proposed was that D ideal can be computed as just the global optic flow rate times tau. And that should give you your ideal deceleration model for a given individual. And so what Dominic wanted to start to look at was that does the model fit change as we increase target speed? Because athletes aren't always looking for ideal. They're looking to accomplish a task as quickly and successfully as possible so that they can win. And so there might be some ways that the athlete state variables are influencing sort of the parameter dynamics and vice versa. And then we looked at a linear mixed effect model to look at, does target speed indicate when at what distance the athletes will begin to decelerate? So will they decelerate sooner or later? And does their deceleration profile look like the idealized model from the Fajan work and ultimately from David Lee's tau work? And so here are, these are 4 example plots from one participant. And you can see across the top here, we have the 50% speed, 66.3%, 83.3, and 100% speed. The green line is the onset of the human deceleration, and that's relative to that blue line. And then the red line is the D ideal deceleration profile. Model fits were only taken from this line on. So we were ignoring sort of the acceleration portion of the model. And what we saw was that the deceleration phase, RMSE, the fit, was significantly different when we got into those higher speed conditions, the 83% and 100% speed conditions. And the distance to targeted deceleration was also lower. So what that basically means, and what we found, is that athletes used a more aggressive deceleration. That means they're decelerating later as target speed increased. So not probably a huge surprise. They're trying to get to their top speed as much as they can before they decelerate because it's harder, but they are prioritizing interception over that smooth deceleration. And this has all kinds of implications for the way we think about musculoskeletal injury, because decelerations and cutting horizontally are known risk factors for biomechanical based orthopedic injury due to increasing loads, shearing forces on ligaments, etc. Not to mention potential for full-on collision. And so the idea that Dominic's running with here is that, okay, you have this, and we're going to start to try to fit the model a bit better to these higher speed conditions. But then what happens when you've sustained a concussion and you aren't able to pick up the visual information as well as you used to, or you're slower in responding to the visual information, and therefore maybe you're not starting your deceleration when you should? Can we use this model to sort of guide those at greatest risk so that we can intervene before it leads to further injury? And so the last experiment is more around sort of just how do changes, sort of natural changes to athlete state variables in terms of neurohealth related insults, in this case concussion history, affect sort of what we're calling risk taking. And I'll explain that in a second. So here we had, again, club sport athletes. Now we're back to just the target speed at 70% of athlete speed. And for this particular analysis, we're looking at a condition where they had to navigate through 12 stationary obstacles while they pursued the moving target. And the reason for that is because this is a DoD funded project, and we're thinking about service members, you know, on the battlefield, not necessarily having to avoid defenders as much as they need to avoid objects in scene as they're trying to navigate, maybe to pursue somebody or get to a location. And then we use a linear mixed effects model to look at minimum passing distance, because one thing that's been shown in the literature is that folks with a concussion history tend to have a lower, smaller passing distance, which is riskier for running into those objects and potentially resulting in additional collisions. And you can see we had concussion history, athlete type, which we divided them out into pursuit and evasion athletes. So think American football, soccer, hockey, basketball, versus non-pursuit and evasion, which would be, you know, tennis, boxing, rowing, those sorts of things. And then we have concussion history by athlete type, trial number, and then sex. And so what we've started to show here, and this is a preliminary analysis, we're going to have 150 athletes by the time this is done, is that athletes with a concussion history, there was a main effect that supported what we've seen in the literature, which is that those with a history of concussion exhibited a lower obstacle passing distance with a pretty strong effect size. And we had p-set to 0.1 for this one because we were looking for that reduced obstacle passing distance. What was interesting, though, when we looked at the interaction, is that this was driven almost exclusively by the non-pursuit and evasion athletes. And actually the pursuit and evasion athletes, which are that lighter blue line, we don't see that reduction in passing distance at all. In fact, it's starting to move in the other direction. So that's also interesting as we think about how we intervene on individuals as they're returning back to sport, and what it might mean for sort of improving their adaptability to these environments by maybe focusing a little bit more on what that action boundary should be for how close you can get to an object, and combining that with their sort of their motor coordination as well. So just to wrap up, I think these experiments are starting to show a more dynamic portrait of athlete resilience. The state dynamics experiments from the reaction time and the visual motor strategies show that we do get real-time adaptive shifts in their behavior, and that the regulation of these the control strategies are based on environmental demands or context-specific changes that we can then characterize using analyses that look at those state dynamics. From a parameter dynamics perspective, this allows us to better understand the underlying modifiability of the system. So it does seem like athletes are tuning their parameters to maintain goal achievement, as you think about the lack of fit of the standard parameters as we were looking at the interception portion of the modeling task. But then we're also seeing that the tau fitting changes as speed increases as well, and there might be a shift in strategies. We're not sure yet, but we think that might be the case. So that parameter dependent control flexibility may be sort of related to how we think about bifurcation behaviors in nonlinear systems. And you might see bifurcations in these parameter dynamics that may or may not be manifesting in terms of the state dynamics as well. And then lastly, some future directions that we've already been exploring. One of the things I'm most interested in is, can we look at how to map an athlete's capacity to reorganize performance across changing task demands? And so if you look at these curves, which I published this in 2002 with my collaborator David Martin, I've been thinking about fitness in this case, not as like physiological fitness, but more as like the fit of the athlete in their environment. And also you could think about parameter dynamics as a fitness variable, so that change and whether you're seeing the change that you would want to see. And so you can use plots like this, which are actually born out of evolutionary biology and some of the work by Berger and colleagues, that we can actually formalize individual profiles of this adaptive capacity, and we can use these to predict thresholds of how the athlete is going to transition across different states of behavior when they're going to start to struggle, based on like the stickiness of the state dynamics, for example. And we can even subdivide these across domains, as you see on the right there, with maybe we're looking at neuromotor state dynamics versus biomechanics versus, you know, perceptual behavior versus physiology. And that can ultimately, I think, inform how we can intervene based on system dynamics at these various levels. So that concludes my talk. I just want to acknowledge my two funding sources. If anybody does want to get in contact, that QR code has my email, etc. And I'm happy to answer questions if we have some time.
So let's thank Professor Kiefer for the great presentation. So I have some questions.
Okay.
So I'll ask them. So I'll just ask a couple maybe. One is on the parameter tau.
Yes.
Right. So the parameter tau is basically defined as the inverse of the derivative of A with respect to A. So it's a normalized, basically it's a normalized quantity, so that it has the measure of time. So now my question related to that is, we are so ultimately it seems that the interest is on the deceleration of the athlete. So why don't you look at the deceleration of the area, or a higher order derivative of the area? So instead of looking at dA over dt, you look at the second derivative A with respect to t over the first derivative, or the third derivative over the second derivative, or something like that.
Yeah.
That it still has the measure of, when you invert it, it still has the measure of time, but it captures something at higher order variations of the trajectory.
Okay, yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I think it's worth exploring. The reason we started where we did was simply because we had a model that Fajan had developed, and we're like, let's just see, right? It's sort of like, if we do nothing new, can we get most of the way there? And it's clear that we can't totally. And so I agree with you. I think there's a lot of opportunity here to see if they're transitioning into this new strategy, is it due to one of these other variables, right? Because that's ultimately the control law that's going to be driving it. And maybe it's not as simple as tau, like you say. So I think it's a great point. I hadn't thought about it as specifically as what you laid out, but it makes a lot of sense to me, for sure.
Awesome. So the other thing I want to ask you is related to, the last part, actually, the one on in which we're talking about risk taking in neural health.
Yeah.
So my understanding is that you have that people who had a concussion, they start to stay a little bit further from obstacles. Is that? Oh, sorry, they're a little bit closer to obstacles.
Yes, correct? They're closer. They end up exhibiting more risky behavior. Yeah. So
I'm wondering if the distance is actually not. It's actually something like a parabola type. Namely, if an athlete, you see someone skiing, for example, if someone is super skilled, it's gonna pass very, very close. Now, maybe if they're less skilled, then it stays a little bit further. But if even the skilled person gets an injury, then may start to be farther again. So maybe the distance depends on not linearly on the skill level of the athlete, but it becomes a little bit something like quadratic. There is a distance in which the athlete, when it's very bad, it stays far. It stays close because maybe there is any ready. When it's super good, it stays close as well because it's everything under control. When it's something in between, then it stays out the way. So I'm wondering if there is that thing ongoing as well. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I would expect we would be able to see that a couple different ways. One would be if we just looked at the speed changes, I think you'll also see that will result in the better athletes being able to take more risks. And I talk about that in terms of like their action boundary. They get closer to that action boundary of the boundary of failure, right? And they're willing to kind of brush up against that boundary because they're skilled and they know that I'm going to be able to do that. Up to a point, and then eventually there's sort of that nonlinear response of eventually I'm going to collide,
and it's not going to be when I expect it to be. But then, if you have that same person that's injured, that completely, I think, changes the mapping of the visual information to the action. And now you get some people even, I think, who would still say, I don't, torpedoes be damned, right? I'm going and I don't care. And you're going to get others who are going to be extra cautious as they're coming back. And I think you would see a nonlinear sort of function that will fit that data. I think we're just at the beginning of this, but that's one of the things I want to explore is how can we change either athlete state variables or environment to see how these things change with the stationary obstacles, because there's a little bit more control there as well.
So the other thing I want to ask about, so do you have EEG measurements?
So great question. We are going to. I'm working with a colleague here who's into the EEG, and we're actually in discussions around, we'll have some grants and also some equipment that we're looking to purchase to look into some of this. I've done a little bit of it with recurrence analysis, but not related to these tasks.
Yeah, because I mean, maybe having force plates or something like that, something practical, because you know that's the people runs and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
But then but having the EEG with the EMG with the kinematics with visual information, perception, something like that basically completes the picture.
Yeah, I agree, and I think you'll probably. So what I've seen, I have run in the past. We didn't publish it because the effects ended up washing out, and I don't know why. So I wasn't confident on it. But we had baseline EEG performance of resting state dynamics, and then we had athletes perform a task right after where it was basically a functional reaction time test. They came off of a box and landed, and as they landed, they had to respond to an arrow pointing left, right, or up. So they had to cut left, cut right, or go up. And we started to see some correlations between the resting state EEG dynamics, which again were collected separately, but they were less sticky, and the reaction time being faster for those people. So those that were more poised and weren't locked in to a certain sort of like neurophysiological pattern were actually more responsive and more efficient in their responses. But again, I have not been able to replicate that, and I'm not super confident on those results. So that's actually what we want to do, is I would love to get, just like we did with the EMG experiment, get EEG prior to them responding, and in the same task, have EMG as well. We could also look at the synchronization and then go after this, because I think there's something there. Yeah.
Awesome. Beautiful. I monopolized the Q&A time, but I don't know, maybe it's still time to conclude, since we stole enough of Professor Kiefer's time. So, well, thank you very much for your great presentation. It was awesome, and it was a great pleasure to have you in our seminar series.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you all as well. I appreciate you all attending, and thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.